Throughout the 1920s, Dell Publications served as the industry standard on print media. Led by a syndicated series of newspaper strips called Famous Funnies, these publications were the go-to source for comedy, satire, and adventure. But a new age was emerging, one which would force Dell Publications out of the limelight as a competitor emerged, with a flagship character that would change print media forever. While the Superman that we know today with the red cape and the blue uniform did not appear until Action Comics issue number 1 in 1938, the origins of Superman can be traced back to his creation at the hands of Joe Shuster in 1933 as a telepathic villain bent on world domination. During this same year, Joe Shuster would introduce his creation to a fellow classmate at Glenville High School in Cleveland, Ohio, named Jerry Siegel, who would go on to publish Superman in his own series titled Science Fiction: The Advanced Guard of Future Civilization. By the following year, as the two worked together, Jerry Siegel would revamp the character, going through a series of drafts, which would ultimately lead to Superman's publication with Action Comics issue number 1 and his establishment of the superhero archetype.
And to fill you in a little on the beginning of it all, one night, as has been mentioned in past stories, ideas kept coming to me, and I kept getting up again and again during the night and just jotting down these ideas and these scripts until very early the next morning I dashed over to Joe's house, which is about 10 blocks away. I showed him the script of Superman, the entirely new concept in which there would be a meek, mild-mannered reporter, Clark Kent, Lois Lane, who scorned him, but who flipped over Superman, not knowing that Superman and Clark Kent were one and the same person. Now, you want to stay? You want to stay with your reaction?
Well, I was very excited about the whole idea. I just took on the same enthusiasm. I thought it was a terrific idea, and we went right to work. Right then and there.
You sat down at the drawing board and you began designing the way the characters would look,
Yeah, we spent the entire day working on it, all afternoon, and we at the drawing board, Jerry and I, and
now I remember that the matter of the costuming of Superman came up, and I remember two suggestions I made to you. One, that the letter S be on his chest.
Right,
as
I wanted
to
give him a skin-tight costume to show up his physique, for one thing, and then Jerry suggested putting on a cape,
so that when the character zoomed through the air, it would give more action and movement to the character.
Make it look like he's really flying, and very
And of course, you added all those additional things like the boots and the belt and the and the whatever.
I wanted to make it as simple as possible.
In the eyes of Siegel and Shuster, the 1930s were a time of social unrest and economic turmoil for the United States. It had been 4 years since the onset of the Great Depression, and while things were taking a turn for the better, for many people, the effects were still being felt. Suicides, robberies, homelessness, and a general sense of scarcity were still a part of American life, and with the possibility of a Second World War looming in the background, society needed something to look up to, something to inspire them with hope, even if only for a short time. To this end, Siegel and Shuster modeled this newest version of Superman after 3 important characters that represented the strength and resiliency of the human spirit. The first was Hugo Danner, of the famed novel Gladiator, written by Philip Wiley in 1930. The result of an experiment at the hands of his father, Hugo Danner was born with incredible strength, but told to keep his powers hidden, as society's inability to understand him would make him a target of fear and ignorance. The second was Hercules, the Roman name used for Heracles, the famed son of Zeus and Alcmene, who imbued the very essence of courage, strength, and ingenuity. And finally, the third inspiration for Superman came in the form of Samson, a man of biblical origin who received incredible strength from God. And so with their newest creation in hand, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster spent the next 6 years trying to find a publisher, trying to find someone who would take this newest character, this Superman, and bring him to the mainstream. It was during this time that Superman was introduced to Consolidated Publishing, and the hope here was that Consolidated Publishing, which had previously released a series called Detective Dan, Secret Operative issue number 48, would pave the way for the comic book industry, and by extension, allow Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster to print their creation. But Consolidated Publishing had only made one story of Detective Dan, and had no intention of moving forward with the series. And so while they had sent an encouraging letter to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster praising their work, with Educational Comics, United Feature Syndicate, and now Consolidated Publishing all rejecting their idea, Shuster became fed up and destroyed all of the pages of Superman with the exception of the cover, which was saved from a fire by Jerry Siegel. And so as Siegel and Shuster recovered from their disappointment and continued their efforts to find someone willing to publish their story of Superman, another comic book icon was emerging. a Tennessee native and writer with a penchant for creating short stories who would develop what many consider to be the very first comic book.
I'm Nikki Wheeler Nicholson, and my grandfather was Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, and he is important because he was the first person to use all original art and scripts for comic books. So he started really the first comic books with original art and scripts. He also hired Siegel and Schuster. He was the first publisher to see the Superman drawings. He hired Bob Kane. He hired Walt Kelly. Basically, a lot of the industry standards in comic books are as a result of my grandfather. He began his career in the pulps, writing adventure stories, and that's one of the reasons that the titles of the comic books are called adventure, action, detective comics, because they come right out of the pulp stories.
A former member of the United States Cavalry, in 1934, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson launched National Allied Publications. Intending to capitalize on the popularity of the Famous Funnies comic strips, Nicholson found that Dell Publications was unwilling to take a risk on his newly established company due to fear that his work wouldn't sell. Refusing to be left out of the fledgling market, Nicholson made history for the first time by launching his own comic book in the form of New Fun Comics #1. Deviating away from the reprinted material found in Famous Funnies, New Fun Comics #1 contained a series of comedic stories involving characters designed by Nicholson himself. However, because the concept was new and money was slow, Nicholson made history a second time by being the first company to offer advertising in its comic book publications in order to offset the cost of production. While Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson would go on to launch Adventure Comics as a second publication, he also discovered that because Famous Funnies was selling so well as it contained characters that the general public was already familiar with, distributors were hesitant to invest in his content because it had never been tested before. In their eyes, Famous Funnies had an established market, and Dell Publications had proven itself capable of providing content that customers would purchase. And so with money running out fast and virtually all doors being closed in his face, Nicholson found himself in a partnership with a man named Harry Donenfeld. As the owner and operator of Independent News, while Harry Donenfeld had occasionally dipped his toe in magazine markets, Independent News largely operated as a distributor as well. Seeing this as his chance to ensure the existence of New Fun Comics and Adventure Comics, as well as introduce his third publication in the form of Detective Comics, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson sacrificed a large majority of the rights to his work in order to allow Harry Donenfeld to provide distribution. With Nicholson and Donenfeld working together and forming a joint company called Detective Comics Incorporated under the umbrella of National Allied Publications, the two began to hire on various writers and artists in an effort to introduce new ideas, and among the creators hired on as part of the Detective Comics Incorporated branch were Siegel and Schuster. While their early work in Detective Comics consisted of stories like Slam Bradley, a private detective with brains and brawn who, for all intents and purposes, was a spiritual predecessor to Batman, Siegel and Schuster also saw this as an opportunity to attempt to introduce Superman. Unfortunately, because of the rapid growth of Detective Comics Incorporated and with the company receiving numerous concepts written or drawn by other aspiring creators, Siegel and Schuster's Superman was quite literally thrown into a pile and completely ignored. While the two continued their work with Slam Bradley, among other creations, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's decision to engage in business with Harry Donenfeld would come back to haunt him. In the summer of 1938, Donenfeld sent Nicholson on a vacation for the purpose of brainstorming and creating new ideas for the company. During Nicholson's vacation, however, Harry Donenfeld filed a lawsuit against Nicholson for non-payment, and because Nicholson's vacation made it impossible for him to appear in court, Donenfeld won the lawsuit by default judgment. As a result, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson was forced out of Detective Comics Incorporated, and Harry Donenfeld retained all rights to National Allied Publications and its properties, including Detective Comics Incorporated, as well as all of the work produced by Nicholson himself. And so with Nicholson out of the picture and Donenfeld in control of Detective Comics Incorporated, while he continued publication and distribution for New Fun Comics, Adventure Comics, and Detective Comics, he also sought to expand the lineup of existing stories, launching a fourth series in the form of Action Comics. But short on material that could be provided to meet the deadline for the launch date, Donenfeld instructed Action Comics editor Vince Sullivan to find content that could quickly be added to issue number 1. Sorting through a stack of write-ins, Vince Sullivan stumbled upon Superman, and as a result, not only was he added to the roster of stories, but printed on the front cover. Originally depicted as a child sent away from a dying world by an unnamed scientist, the newborn was discovered by 2 passing motorists who took him to a local orphanage. While there, he demonstrated incredible strength, and as the years passed, he was able to leap 1/8 of a mile, raise tremendous weights, and run faster than an express train, all due to his advanced physiology and the fact that his race was endowed with incredible strength once they reached maturity. With the name Clark Kent operating as a disguise, Superman served to fight on behalf of the common man. Within the pages of Action Comics issue number 1, Siegel and Shuster also developed Superman's main love interest in the form of Lois Lane, a tough-as-nails journalist whose name is actually a derivative of Lola Lane, one of 3 sisters that performed as a 1930s singing act. Considered by many to be the first lady of comics and the quintessential damsel in distress, in truth, the development of her character was influenced by 3 individuals. Physically, Lois Lane was designed to look like Joanne Carter, the future wife of Jerry Siegel, who started her modeling career after posing for a series of drawings by Siegel while he was working on the concept for Lois Lane. In terms of personality, Siegel and Shuster used the fictional character of Torchy Blaine, a no-nonsense reporter who did what it took to get the story and was played by Glenda Farrell in a series of 1930s films, as well as Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, the famed photojournalist who traveled around the world in 72 days. For Siegel and Shuster, Lois Lane existing as both a reporter and a love interest of Superman was a combination that inspired elation, suspense, and comedy among fans. Working directly with Clark Kent, the banter between the two was a hallmark of their friendship, and as a love interest of Superman, Lois served to ground his character and make him more human despite his alien origins. But as a reporter, fans always wondered if she would ever learn that Clark Kent and Superman were one and the same. However, following the release of Action Comics number 1, Harry Donenfeld considered both the character of Superman and the concept to be ridiculous, and while he had intended for Superman to be removed from publication and effectively locked away, his mind was changed when, as the legend goes, he approached a young boy at a comic stand, and when he asked why the young man was buying Action Comics issue number 1, the boy replied, "Because it's the one that has Superman." With sales of Action Comics cementing that Superman was here to stay, the golden age of comics had begun, and the comic book industry was off to the races. Selling the rights to their creation for $130 in a contract to supply material, by 1939, the success of Superman saw Siegel and Shuster collaborating with the introduction of a solo series titled Superman number 1, which ran alongside Action Comics, but differed in that the stories of his solo series focused largely on Superman himself, instead of including supporting characters like Lois Lane, which were frequently seen in Action Comics. During this same year, the Man of Steel received his own radio show program titled The Adventures of Superman, and by 1941, the world was met with Superman's first animated film created by Fleischer Studios, the now infamous, although defunct animation studio, based out of New York City. Not all was perfect for DC's newest creation though. While Superman's success saw the introduction of heroes like Batman, the standout star of Detective Comics, and a rival that would remain one of Superman's closest competitors in both sales and popularity, the golden age of comics also saw the introduction of characters similar to Superman, the closest of which was a hero named Captain Marvel. The 1939 brainchild of writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, Captain Marvel's popularity rivaled Superman in that while the Man of Steel was the first superhero, Captain Marvel had something Superman didn't: a child with superpowers. With comic books becoming increasingly popular among young boys, the allure of Superman came in the form of imagination and the possibility that his readers could live vicariously through his comics and right the wrongs of their own lives using the Man of Steel's fantastic powers. Capitalizing on this sentiment, Fawcett Comics, a division of Fawcett Publications looking to cash in on the rise of superheroes, introduced Captain Marvel as a young homeless boy named Billy Batson, who was led to a wizard named Shazam. Recognizing the financial struggles of Billy Batson, as well as the courage he displayed in the face of such hardship, the wizard bestowed Billy with the power to become a superhero by shouting the word Shazam. Because Captain Marvel provided fans with the belief that a child could become equal to Superman, the sales of Captain Marvel soared and even led to a radio show that predated Superman's. And so, recognizing the success of Captain Marvel and that his character appeared to be a carbon copy of Superman, DC filed a lawsuit on the grounds of copyright infringement, a case which would go on to remain in court for over 10 years. By the time the 1940s came around, Superman was cemented as a mainstay in pop culture, but at the time, his stories largely consisted of 1 or 2 issue battles between himself and a gangster or some small-time villain. In the minds of Siegel and Shuster, in order for their creation to have longevity outside of this initial comic boom, Superman needed a nemesis, an arch-villain that would return constantly to face him. However, because Superman's abilities were largely physical, with strength, speed, and power, his nemesis needed to be the other half of the equation and possess a level of intelligence that would test the Man of Steel and push him to both his moral and mental limits. To this end, Siegel and Shuster introduced Lex Luthor in the pages of Action Comics issue number 23 as a megalomaniac bent on world domination. In his first appearance, Luthor had amassed an army by way of mind control and was in the midst of pitting two unnamed European countries against one another when Lois Lane stumbled upon his plan. Sending a note off to Superman through a soldier who was unaffected by Lex Luthor's devices, Lois Lane was eventually rescued and Lex Luthor was defeated. Testing the waters a second time, Lex Luthor returned in Superman issue number 4 in 1940, but Siegel and Shuster also used this as a way to establish Superman's moral limits in addition to his wits. With Lex Luthor challenging Superman to a series of tests regarding his strength, speed, and durability, at the conclusion, Superman threatened to throw Luthor into his own plane, cracking his skull in the process. While Luthor admitted defeat, this situation went towards the darker nature of Superman during the Golden Age, and that he was willing to kill, and in the case where someone willingly threatened his life or the life of someone around him, expressed little remorse over their deaths. However, as time passed, Joe Shuster's eyesight began to deteriorate, but because Superman's popularity was at a fever pitch, leading to appearances in World's Finest and other DC publications, Shuster was unable to keep up with the increased workload. In response, he launched his own studio, which hired on artists such as Jack Burnley, Fred Ray, Wayne Boring, and Al Plastino, all of whom would become known as some of the most iconic artists for the Superman title. During this time, however, the world was changing. Germany had already invaded Poland, and World War II was underway. With the United States remaining neutral for both political and social reasons, Superman's comics during the early days of World War II maintained his role as fighting criminals and corrupt politicians, as well as saving the day. But after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, leading to a declaration of war by the United States, Superman, like nearly all comic book superheroes, reflected this, and that his story saw a shift from fighting on American soil to fighting overseas. While the Superman publications never officially used terms like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, the propaganda within his comic books was clear. Superman supports the Allied troops, and so should you. And so by 1945, at the close of World War II, following the surrender of Japan aboard the USS Missouri, as the most popular title DC had at the time, the Superman comics began to shift their focus back to the United States. With Dick Grayson introduced as Robin in 1940 and serving as a driving force behind Batman's popularity among children, DC looked to incorporate this element into the Superman mythos as a way to expand on his character and increase sales. And so in this same year, under the writing and artistry of Siegel and Shuster, DC officially launched Superboy. Appearing for the first time in More Fun Comics issue number 101, because of Superman's popularity, Superboy was an immediate hit among fans. Introducing concepts like Superman's hometown of Smallville, Superboy provided fans with the evolution of Superman and filled the gap between his arrival on Earth and his undertaking of the Superman mantle. This combined with Superman issue number 53 in 1948 retelling his origin story by introducing Jor-El as Superman's father, meant that during a time when the popularity of superheroes was on the decline following the end of World War II, Superboy was actually gaining popularity, and so by 1949, he received his own solo series, aptly titled Superboy No. 1. During this same year, and after its creation for the Superman radio show in 1943, under William Woolfolk, fans were met with the comic book introduction of Kryptonite. Originally depicted as red in color, its first introduction into the comic books explains that Kryptonite arrived on Earth following Krypton's destruction and served to provide a weakness to Superman, an aspect of his character that made him all the more relatable, which in turn fueled the flames of his popularity. In the eyes of fans, it seemed as though the publications of Superman were nothing short of perfect, a sentiment that would be compounded on during the Silver Age, which would see Superman's origins revisited and answers provided to some of his fans' most burning questions. By 1952, the success of Superman and Superboy was undeniable. The Man of Steel had captured the imagination of millions, and his comics stood on shelves around the country. Conversely, Superboy had provided fans with the life of Clark Kent between his arrival on Earth and the time he became Superman. However, the popularity of superheroes was rapidly fading to be replaced by science fiction comics and invaders from outer space. Attempting to keep up with the changing times and revitalize interest in superheroes, under the direction of DC editor Julius Schwartz and writer Gardner Fox, best known for creating characters like the Green Lantern Alan Scott, the Flash Jay Garrick, and the Justice League predecessor, the Justice Society of America, DC effectively rebooted their continuity for the very first time, bringing an end to the Golden Age, starting the Silver Age, and by extension, expanding on the world and capabilities of Superman. With the United States in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union following the end of World War II, under the Eisenhower administration, the idea of space exploration was rapidly coming to be a reality. While man would not land on the moon until 1969 under the presidency of Richard Nixon, because space travel was as much an ingrained part of science fiction as it was a legitimate possibility, the Silver Age powers of Superman grew to reflect these technological advancements, and included traveling to the depths of space, as well as massive expansions to his host of abilities including super hearing, super speed, and super strength. However, for many fans, there seemed to be no explanation as to how these abilities were so much more enhanced than they were during his Golden Age counterpart, and so to answer this question, DC introduced two concepts. The first was the multiverse, and the second was the Yellow Sun. With the Superman and Superboy titles coming under the control of legendary editor Mort Weisinger in 1957 as part of DC's attempt to relaunch their characters and provide fresh backstories, Weisinger delegated a number of changes to the Superman mythos and in doing so, established much of the content that exists today. The task of expanding on the mythos was both easy and difficult. Because Superman was so popular, like the Great Gold Rush of 1849, DC found itself inundated with prospective writers and artists looking to make a name for themselves by receiving their moment in the spotlight. On the other hand, Superman fans guarded their hero with jealous eyes and were avidly against anyone making changes that deviated too far from the original content. Looking to find a balance by appealing to new fans and appeasing old fans, where early stories stated that Superman's powers were tied directly to his physiology in addition to Krypton's gravity in relation to Earth, and where Superman issue number 53 introduced Jor-El as the father of Superman, and issue number 146, which served as part of DC's Silver Age retelling of the origins for their various characters, Weisinger rolled these elements over and introduced Krypton's Red Sun as a reason for not only why Kryptons didn't have powers on their own planet, but more so than that, explained the basis behind Superman's new abilities. As it was explained, the gravity of Krypton was several times more intense than Earth, and so when Superman arrived, the difference in gravity allowed for both super strength and flight. In addition to this, the ultraviolet rays emitted by Earth's yellow sun hardened Superman's skin, making it impenetrable to Earth's weapons, as well as enhancing his 5 senses, allowing him to achieve extraordinary feats. During this same year, a long-awaited team-up took place between Batman and Superman. Spearheaded by Edmund Hamilton, the father of science fiction and a writer for some of Superman and Batman's best stories in the late Golden and early Silver Ages, the team-up between the two only served to push their popularity to greater heights. As the original superhero, Superman stood atop the pantheon with incredible strength and vast abilities. But in contrast, Batman was a normal human with incredible wealth and extraordinary physical training, who represented the power of human ingenuity. Combining both characters in Superman issue number 76, which featured a story that saw the duo's attempt to stop a criminal escaping with stolen diamonds, many comic historians consider this to be one of the most important stories of the Silver Age, as this team-up served to confirm that the superheroes of DC Comics existed in a shared universe and opened the door for a friendship between Batman and Superman, as well as laying the foundations for the introduction of the Justice League in 1956. Continuing to expand on Superman and his place within DC, in 1954 and 1958, at the direction of Weisinger, writer Otto Bender created 2 stories titled Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen and Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane in order to focus on the Man of Steel supporting cast without sidetracking from his main stories. Because Superman was so popular, and by extension fans were clamoring for most anything that expanded on his publications, both series were extremely successful, with Lois Lane's solo series selling just below Superman and Superboy at the peak of its popularity. However, in addition to the questions regarding Superman's increased abilities between the end of the Golden Age and the start of the Silver Age, questions also remain involving the characters of Flash and Green Lantern. Because the Silver Age saw the removal of Jay Garrick and Alan Scott as their respective characters and replaced with Barry Allen and Hal Jordan without an explanation, in 1961, DC launched a story called The Flash of Two Worlds, which served to establish the multiverse, and stating that the versions of Superman and others who appeared between the dawn of DC Comics in 1938 up to the retelling of their origins in the 1950s existed in a separate universe called Earth 2, with the current versions existing in a reality called Earth 1. In addition to this, with the Justice League established in 1956 by Gardner Fox, albeit with only occasional appearances by Superman, once again under the expansive direction of Mort Weisinger, writer Jerry Coleman introduced the Fortress of Solitude with Action Comics issue number 241. Initially appearing without an explanation of how it was built, the Fortress of Solitude was designed by Superman as a place of solace and a way to keep elements of his Kryptonian heritage, but also as a tribute to the most important individuals in his life. Originally accessible by unlocking it with a giant key that could only be lifted by those with incredible strength, the Fortress of Solitude contained rooms dedicated to various villains including Lex Luthor and Metallo, but also friends like Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Batman. And so with the Silver Age basis for Superman established and well received by fans, and because the reception of Superboy meant that the public was open to new versions of Superman, DC looked to expand on the Man of Steel's role in their lineup, as well as tap into the demographic of women and young girls by creating a female version of Superman that wouldn't hinder his romance with Lois Lane and instead would serve as a support role to fight alongside both Superman and Superboy. Created in 1958 by Otto Bender, Supergirl's introduction actually came out of several experiments involving a female counterpart to Superman. Like the Lois Lane Superwoman of Action Comics issue number 60 in 1943, the version depicted in Superman number 123 came as an experiment by DC to gauge fan reaction to a legitimate version of Superman who was a woman. Created by Jimmy Olsen after discovering a totem that granted 3 wishes, the events also came with a compelling story centering on Lois Lane. As the main love interest of Superman, Otto Bender sought to build speculation on the possibility that Lois Lane was being replaced in an effort to drive controversy among fans and in turn, drive interest in Supergirl's introduction. As the story saw both Superman and Supergirl fighting together, it was also relatively short, in that Superman discovered a bridge washed out, he was able to save it, and discovered that the entire scenario was a trap set up by unknown criminals looking to kill Superman by exposing him to green kryptonite while he tried to save the train. With Supergirl jumping in to save Superman, her demise came about when she picked up green kryptonite not knowing the danger it represented. After being exposed to its radiation for too long, she succumbed to its fatal effects. Making her way back to Jimmy Olsen, she asks him to wish her out of existence, something he agrees to do. And so following this story, fan reaction to the concept of Supergirl was overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of letters pouring in to the head offices of DC Comics. As a result, Kara Zor-El, the most well-known version of Supergirl, made her appearance in the pages of Action Comics issue number 252 and was created once again by Otto Bender. Providing a true backstory for her character this time, Otto Bender established that Kara Zor-El survived the explosion of Krypton along with her father and her mother and several others. As a result of Krypton's explosion, the chunk of rock they were living on had become an irradiated chunk of kryptonite. Placing a layer of lead on the ground to keep themselves protected, a meteor shower composed of irradiated chunks of Krypton took place and polluted the atmosphere with the effects of green kryptonite. Seeing no option besides sending their daughter away in an effort to save her life, Kara and her mother searched the cosmos, eventually locating Earth. Realizing that Superman had been sent to that planet and had been endowed with superpowers after his arrival, Kara's parents chose that location, and using a rocket ship similar to the ship Superman arrived in, Kara was sent to Earth where she encountered the Man of Steel, was enrolled in an orphanage, and adopted the mantle of Supergirl, remaining hidden from the world, until Action Comics issue number 285, when she was publicly revealed by Superman. And so with their newest creation in hand, Supergirl was rolled over into her own series under Adventure Comics, and alongside Superboy and Krypto the Superdog, opened the door for a host of new characters to be introduced into the Superman family, including Comet the Superhorse, Streaky the Supercat, and Beppo the Super Monkey. By 1962, fans were beginning to notice a trend. With Mort Weisinger operating as the sole editor of all Superman titles and aiming to add something new to the Superman landscape every 6 months, in addition to trying to separate Silver Age Superman from his Golden Age version, almost all continuity prior to his introduction as editor in 1957 was either being completely ignored or rewritten. In 1960, with Adventure Comics issue number 271, at the direction of Weisinger, Jerry Siegel, who had since returned to writing for DC, established that the hatred between Lex Luthor and Superman dates back to the Man of Steel's years as Superboy, when he met Lex Luthor as a teenager. As a fan of Superboy, and looking to become the world's greatest scientist, Luthor had developed an antidote to kryptonite, but when a fire broke out, Superboy used his breath to put it out and destroyed Luthor's experiment in the process. Losing his hair and blaming Superboy by claiming that he was jealous of Lex Luthor's intelligence, the animosity formed by Luthor towards Superboy was used to explain his early appearances in Superman comics and why he had such a hatred for the hero. While some of these changes angered some fans in that their favorite stories from the time between the Silver Age and the Golden Age were being ignored, in the end, it served the purpose of creating a more tight-knit continuity that allowed for existing readers to pick up Superboy titles, read about an encounter, and pick up with its fruition in the Superman titles or one of its related books. With this benefited existing fans, it also began to create a web of nightmares for potential fans. With the introduction of the DC multiverse in 1961 and the crossovers that came with it, individuals looking to get into Superman comics were met with a massive interweaving of stories that began in one comic and concluded over the course of several others. As a result, these potential fans found themselves frustrated and in turn began to take notice of a competitor who was introducing heroes that didn't gain their abilities from a yellow sun, but from the effects of cosmic rays. By 1962, Marvel Comics had introduced the Fantastic Four as a response to DC's Justice League of America. Led by the now infamous duo of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the Fantastic Four shot the company to instant success, which was then capitalized on with the introduction of Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and the Avengers. Forced to share the limelight with their newest competitor, DC had to find ways to make Superman more accessible and fast, or they stood to lose their position as the top company in the world of comic books. To this end, in 1962 under Edmund Hamilton, Action Comics number 293 saw the return of Red Kryptonite, Previously introduced in Adventure Comics number 252 in 1958, over the course of various comics, red kryptonite was established to affect Superman in random ways, with no two samples working the same way. Making his return in Action Comics number 293, Edmund Hamilton used this to launch a story titled The Feud Between Clark Kent and Superman, which saw a sample of red kryptonite splitting the Man of Steel into two distinct personalities, the heroic Clark Kent and the villainous Superman. In 1964, with Justice League issue number 29, DC introduced Earth 3, a universe that existed opposite of the Earth 1 continuity, which saw the first appearance of the Crime Syndicate, a group consisting of evil versions of DC's characters, with this version of Superman called Ultraman. Try as they might, while these stories were aimed at maintaining existing readership while bringing in new readers, it only served to complicate the Superman landscape. And so by 1970, Mort Weisinger had retired from DC after a 30-year career and was replaced by Julius Schwartz, the man instrumental in the success of the Silver Age. Under Julius Schwartz, where Weisinger had a more grandiose view of Superman, Schwartz wanted a more tamed-down version that returned to his Golden Age roots. To achieve this, the various Superman titles were split up, with editor E. Nelson Bridwell taking over Lois Lane, girlfriend of Superman, Mike Sekowsky taking over Adventure Comics, and Murray Boltinoff taking over Action Comics, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and Superboy, leaving Julius Schwartz in charge of Superman Proper and World's Finest, a line of comics featuring team-ups between Batman and the Man of Steel. Believing that Superman had become too powerful and unrelatable during the era of Weisinger, and that the landscape had become too convoluted, Julius Schwartz brought in Dennis O'Neil, who had been writing the Green Arrow and Wonder Woman titles and alongside the aforementioned editors, cut a swath through the Man of Steel's continuity by eliminating the element of kryptonite, which Schwartz believed had become an overused plot device, canceling the Imaginary Stories line, which served as a series of publications outside of the existing Superman continuity, and rolled Lois Lane, girlfriend of Superman, and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen titles into Superman Family, which served as an anthology for the previously mentioned comics, among others. In addition to this, Julius Schwartz killed off the villains Mr. Mxyzptlk, Bizarro, and Titano, as well as Krypto the dog, arguably the most famous animal in DC Comics. With comics like 1971 Superman number 233 initiating the Sandman saga, which saw Superman's power reduced, as well as his return to fighting villains on Earth for a majority of his issues, because fans were writing in by the droves requesting a return to cosmic adventures and the threats that came with them, by the time the Sandman saga concluded with Superman issue number 242 in 1971, DC canceled the new Superman line and replaced both Julius Schwartz and Dennis O'Neil with Cary Bates. However, the damage had been done, and following the Schwartz era's conclusion in 1972, where some viewed that the age of Superman was over and that the Man of Steel was rapidly shrinking into oblivion, DC had a plan to not only return Superman to relevance, but to shake pop culture to its core with a story that would change comic books forever. With Superman established as the preeminent superhero following his introduction in Action Comics issue number 1 in 1938, in his first appearances, Superman's powers were largely simple. Because pulp comics predated Superman's arrival by serving as a popular source of fictional stories in the 1920s and the 1930s, ranging from detective works to heroics, while characters like Doc Savage, the Shadow, and the Phantom Detective lacked any kind of superpowers in the traditional sense, their popularity was largely rooted in the fact that they fought crime using their personal attributes, including a photographic memory, martial arts, as well as their intelligence. Where the goal of Siegel and Shuster was to move heroes into a new echelon by introducing powers, a balance had to be maintained by changing things enough that Superman would invoke interest, but not so much that he seemed too far-fetched in the eyes of prospective fans. To this end, with his original introduction, Siegel and Shuster established that Superman's powers were a byproduct of his alien physiology, and as a result, the Man of Steel could leap 1/8 of a mile, or the length of 2 football fields, lift tremendous weights, run faster than an express train, and withstand artillery at point-blank range. However, with the introduction of Superman came creations from other publication companies like Fawcett Comics, who were looking to capitalize on and replace Superman with their own heroes like Captain Marvel. In response, DC found itself swept up in a maelstrom of frenzied attempts to keep Superman on par with his competitors, some of whom had already demonstrated the power of flight. And so in Action Comics issue number 8, Superman was demonstrated as being able to outrace a speeding bullet for the very first time. In Action Comics issue number 11, he was provided with X-ray vision allowing him to see through walls, as well as super hearing, which provided him with the ability to spy on and eliminate criminal activities. And in Action Comics issue number 20, he was demonstrated as having super breath, which allowed him to knock over individuals who intended harm to themselves or others. While these powers were largely introduced within the context of the story and made Superman virtually indestructible and incredibly powerful in comparison to the technology of the time, these abilities also left the Man of Steel open to the possibility of expanding his powers, something that saw fruition under Fleischer Studios in 1941 with their introduction of 8 short-length Superman features.
Up in the sky, look! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman!
As a now-defunct animation company based out of New York and formed by Max and David Fleischer, it was during the creation of these films that Superman would first gain the power of flight. Having been contacted by its parent company, Paramount Pictures, for the purpose of creating a series of animated shorts based on the newly created Superman, but in the midst of a project titled Mr. Bug Goes to Town, the goal of the Fleischer brothers was to keep their workload simple and to focus on only one film at a time in order to ensure quality over quantity. However, because Paramount was the parent company and served to finance the Fleischers' projects, the idea was to effectively turn down the request without damaging the contract between the two. To this end, the Fleischers quoted Paramount an outrageous price of $100,000 per episode, which was 4 times higher than the $25,000 cost of producing other animations of the time, like Popeye the Sailor. Furthermore, once Paramount had negotiated the price down to $50,000, the Fleischers found that the depiction of Superman leaping 1/8 of a mile seemed silly given the high quality of the animated features and the fact that by Whiz Comics issue number 5, Captain Marvel had already demonstrated the ability to fly. And so after contacting DC Comics, the Fleischers were granted approval to remove the ability to leap distances and replace it with the power of flight. With fans relishing in both the idea that Superman could fly, as well as the increased sense of urgency that could be created from his races to save Lois Lane with only moments to spare, this concept was rolled over into the comic books, and by Action Comics issue number 123 in 1948, flight was officially added to Superman's repertoire as an enhancement to his ability to leap incredible distances. However, with the ever-increasing expanse of his powers in offhanded ways based on particular stories, the problems faced by fans was that some powers remained while others were removed. This was compounded on following the end of World War II, when the idea of the late 1940s to the late 1950s saw Superman thrown into the realm of science fiction. Because alien invaders and creatures from space were increasing in popularity with the introduction of shows like 1951's Tales of Tomorrow, a spiritual predecessor to The Twilight Zone, the stories of Superman were adjusted to include the use of science fiction concepts. Furthermore, in addition to the need for DC to create new material in order to keep up with competitors like Captain Marvel from Fawcett Comics, whose powers were continually being expanded on to keep up with and overshadow Superman, DC was also facing a crisis following the departure of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in 1947. As a byproduct of a lengthy legal battle over the rights to Superman, without Siegel and Shuster to continue the trend of overseeing the expansion of Superman's character and stories, the duties of editor were turned over to Mort Weisinger. While Weisinger had worked with DC Comics in the early 1940s and was instrumental in creating characters like Aquaman and Green Arrow, with the departure of Siegel and Shuster, his attention was now turned to remodeling their creation by elevating the powers of Superman, and in doing so, establish a self-contained world along with a super family. To this end, where the era of 1948 to 1958 is largely referred to as the Lost Decade, in that many of the stories were considered silly and largely ignored, with Mort Weisinger taking over control as editor in 1958, Superman began to see massive expansions to his powers. In Superman Volume 1, issue number 146 in 1961, Weisinger consolidated all of the information regarding Superman's powers as well as the basis behind them, eliminated what he didn't want, and kept what he considered to be material that would create for more compelling stories and serve his ultimate goal. Considered by many comic book historians to be a soft reboot of sorts for the Man of Steel's powers, Weisinger established that Superman had incredible strength, a physical body and clothing that could not be harmed by any weapon on the face of the earth, including atomic bombs, X-ray vision that could see through walls and melt steel, and that he operated as a servant of the common man and protector of the earth. Furthermore, Superman's flight had always been an aspect of his powers, and that as a baby, his flight would manifest itself, but he had no control of it. To achieve control over this ability to fly, during his teenage years as Superboy, Jonathan Kent had helped him to master his control over flying in a similar capacity to learning how to ride a bike with training wheels. And so with these powers established, Weisinger took the next step of forming their basis by stating that the extreme gravity on Krypton caused the muscles of Kryptonians to become extremely dense, and that when Superman arrived on Earth, by default, the lighter gravity of Earth allowed for super speed, reflexes strength, and invulnerability. In addition to this, because Krypton had a red sun, instead of the sun's suppressing abilities, it simply didn't activate the portion of the brain that allowed for powers. On the other hand, the yellow sun of Earth energized this portion of the brain and awakened Superman's powers of X-ray vision, telescopic vision, and the like. And so following this consolidation, between 1960 and 1970, Superman's powers were expanded on within the context of stories and based largely on the situation itself, rather than the practicality of the power in question. As a result, fans were met with a series of increasingly ridiculous displays of powers, like 1961's Action Comics issue number 273, where Superman sneezed a galaxy out of existence, and 1967's Superboy issue number 120, where he pulled a chain of planets out of a dying galaxy. While some of these abilities were only featured once and never seen again, DC had taken no steps to retcon these powers, meaning that over the course of his lifetime leading up to the conclusion of the Silver Age, Superman had amassed the powers of time travel, invulnerability, faster-than-light travel, super speed, hearing, and strength, as well as telepathy, telekinesis, heat vision, hypnosis, among others. And so by 1970, with Krypto the dog, Supergirl, Superboy, and the rest of the Super family in existence, all of whom possessed the same level of strength and powers of Superman, Weisinger retired from DC Comics, and in his place came Julius Schwartz. As a protagonist and firm believer in the practical nature of powers rather than the godlike displays of Superman's stories under Weisinger, Schwartz believed that Superman's powers had systematically destroyed the ability for Schwartz and his team to create compelling stories, and in turn, sought to return the Man of Steel to his Golden Age roots by reducing his powers to 1/3 of what they had been during the 1960s. With Superman issue number 233, Julius Schwartz initiated a series commonly referred to as the Sandman Saga. In the events of this story, a scientist had been attempting to power a machine using the energy of kryptonite, but when the experiment went awry, all kryptonite on Earth was rendered inert and had no effect on Superman. Continuing the trend of retconning the Man of Steel, Julius Schwartz introduced the Sand Superman. As a byproduct of the experimental failure and the elimination of kryptonite, a portal was formed between Earth and the Quorum Dimension. While only appearing for the sake of this story, a fraction of the Quorum Dimension's psychic energy manifested on Earth where it took on the form of a sand version of Superman. Draining power from the Man of Steel each time Superman engaged in battle, but looking to take on the role of a superhero, at the conclusion of the story, the two came to the realization that Sand Superman consisted of negatively charged energy, while Superman consisted of positively charged energy, and that if the two were to touch, it would start a chain reaction that would destroy the Earth. Engaged in a stalemate, the Sand Superman made the decision to return to his own dimension, with Superman refusing to have his vast powers returned to him. As a result, while he maintained most of his prominent abilities, the powers of hypnosis, time travel, and the like, were removed, leaving him with powers similar to his Golden Age form. While the intention of Julius Schwartz was rooted in a desire to make Superman more relatable, for fans, Superman was a larger-than-life hero, and his role in the DC universe had to reflect that, and so within one issue of the Sandman Saga's completion, Julius Schwartz was removed from the title, and in the publications leading up to Crisis on Infinite Earths, Superman's Silver Age powers were slowly restored. So in our last video on Doomsday and the events leading up to this story, we had talked about how Superman had fallen out of relevancy following Crisis on Infinite Earths, and had been steadily losing the battle for sales against Batman. Where DC had intended to launch a year-long event which culminated in his marriage to Lois Lane, because DC had to work alongside the New Adventures of Lois and Clark TV show which could write the marriage of Clark and Lois as a part of their series and garner more money for DC from their end, the decision was made to have the writers of Superman stories return to the drawing board and mock up a new year-long event which would focus on returning him to relevance. Electing to kill Superman rather than marry him to Lois, in the final pages of the Man of Steel issue number 17, Superman issue number 73, Adventures of Superman number 496, and Action Comics issue number 683, DC featured an enigmatic being shrouded in green, punching his way through a metal wall with the caption "Doomsday is coming," leading to Man of Steel issue number 18 with the first full on-panel appearance of Doomsday. Now, the way in which DC elected to bring Doomsday to the landscape within these first few pages was actually a slow burn. What I mean here is that rather than providing us with a full-on display of the Doomsday that we all know, instead, the idea here was to draw some measure of mystery involving what it is that he looked like and what he was capable of. The reason for this was that historically, the only members of Superman's rogues gallery who functioned under the banner of mystery were those who were highly intelligent and used pawns in a greater scheme to attempt to kill Clark, only revealing themselves as the masterminds at the end of the story. However, by introducing Doomsday in a mysterious manner, this essentially went towards the overarching theme of DC changing everything we know about the standard method of Superman and his various battles. In addition to this, over the course of the next several pages, DC continues to establish the nature of Doomsday in several ways. The first is by having him kill a bird that stumbles into his hand. Now, on its surface, this is pretty insignificant, but in truth, it's designed to tell us exactly what Doomsday is all about. Unlike Superman, who exists for the preservation of life, Doomsday functions as a violent being that revels in chaos and death. Moreover, his love for destruction is evident in his first arrival in a highly populated area. Taking to a bridge, ripping it apart, and killing people in the process, Doomsday expresses no concern over the lives of humanity and the death and destruction that he causes. Now from here, we jump to Doomsday encountering the Justice League as it existed during this time and its continuity. Now for those of you who have seen my video on the publication history of the Justice League, I'm going to ask you to bear with me for the next few minutes while I rehash a bit of that information for those who haven't. In my video on the League, we had talked about how during the pre-Crisis continuity between 1960 when the team was originally formed, leading up to 1985 with Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Justice League was largely composed of DC's top heroes at the time, including Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, and Green Lantern, with Batman and Superman appearing periodically, as well as a revolving door of sorts with smaller heroes. However, by the time Crisis on Infinite Earths came around, DC's top-tier lineup had established itself as being capable of drawing high sales without coming together to battle various foes. As a result, in the post-Crisis continuity, DC reshuffled both the roster and purpose of the League, and that the old guard was removed from its lineup. Justice League of America was retitled Justice League International, operating on a broader scale, and the team was now composed of smaller characters who would otherwise have been unable to gain exposure on their own. As a result, because this idea proved to be successful, within 5 years going into the early 90s, DC shook things up again by eliminating the Justice League International team and splitting its roster up among 2 other teams called Justice League Europe and Justice League America, with 3 more titles introduced called Extreme Justice, Justice League Task Force, and Justice League Quarterly. Now regarding the death of Superman, the team that we see here is Justice League America, with its roster consisting of former Green Lantern Guy Gardner, who was now powered by a yellow ring, Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, Ice, who could manipulate the cold, Bloodwind, who held a gem allowing for unspecified but possibly vast powers, and Maxima, who was an extremely powerful psychic with superhuman strength. Now regarding Bloodwind, something I want to point out here is that during this time in DC's continuity, this is actually Martian Manhunter. To sidetrack for a second, while this information wasn't revealed until after the death of Superman, because Bloodwind derives his power from the energy of the dead, a being named Rot was confined within his blood gem and at some point in the past trapped Bloodwind inside his own jewel, while simultaneously forcing Martian Manhunter to operate as Bloodwind while seeking a means to allow Rot to escape his prison. Now where Justice League issues 76 and 77 would see Rot defeated, Bloodwind return to the land of the living, and Martian Manhunter returning to his normal self, the revelation of this deception by Rot served to retroactively explain why Martian Manhunter was not seen during the League's battle with Doomsday. And so jumping back into the story, after being contacted regarding Doomsday ripping through outlying territories in Ohio, something to also note here is that while the Justice League America attempts to fight Doomsday and end his rampage, at the same time, Superman is conducting an interview with Catherine Grant. To sidetrack here, Catherine was originally introduced into DC Comics in 1987 as a potential love interest for Clark, creating a new dynamic that contained the possibility of Superman leaving Lois Lane for someone new. Where DC eventually elected to drop this plotline, Catherine remained a part of DC's continuity, popping up here and there, but largely functioning as a gossip columnist at the Daily Planet, rather than being a tried and true journalist like Lois Lane. But within the context of this interview, the statements of Superman are designed to juxtapose his role in the DC universe with his impending death. What I mean here is that Catherine cites his history in being a role model for many of DC's heroes and even anti-heroes, and where the writer doesn't say it, this is meant to expand beyond his role in the DC universe and encompass the influence of his creation on the comic book industry as a whole. Since the archetype of superheroes by way of Superman is a topic I've covered all too often, there's really no need for us to do it again here. But where the Justice League is completely dismantled by Doomsday and their efforts to subdue him, the interview with Superman moves to the Q&A segment when the audience is allowed to speak with him directly. In this instance, one of the members asks Superman the question of whether or not there's anything that he truly fears. Now his answer here is extremely important in that DC introduces something into the story called dramatic irony. Within the realm of literary works, whether they be in the form of film, comics, or theater, dramatic irony is the idea that the audience is aware of something that the hero isn't. In this instance, we know Superman will die in his fight against Doomsday, and that his death will not only change the DC landscape, but comics as a whole. However, within this story, Superman does not know this, and so his statement of having previously encountered being strong enough to kill him, but always coming out on top is ironic, and that it illustrates the fact that this interview and the coming battle were intended to be his last, and that at the end of it all, when the dust settles, those in this audience and the heroes left alive will have to face the fact that the greatest of their heroes had died. Now having said that, where Superman continues his interview by answering the questions of the audience, the conflict between himself and Doomsday comes to a head when the entire segment is stopped by the producer, who informs everyone that some kind of conflict is taking place in the suburbs of Ohio and that a villain has completely dismantled the Justice League. Taking off to meet the threat, the concern of Clark is that where the League isn't composed of the most powerful beings on Earth, these individuals are highly formidable given their various levels of technology, strength, psionic powers, and battle experience. As such, aside from maybe Darkseid or Brainiac, there aren't many people who could take the entire League down to such a degree that they were left in shambles. Furthermore, with Booster Gold as the last man standing, we're told that the League has no idea of what's going on. The reason why is because between the time when they first arrived to battle Doomsday and the current moment, only a few minutes had passed, which gives us a strong understanding of how powerful Doomsday is, and that it took him less than 5 minutes to crush the entire Justice League. Something to also note is that once Superman arrives and rescues Booster Gold, Doomsday is given his actual name when Booster says that Doomsday is here. From here, Superman and Booster descend to the ground, at which point Clark and Doomsday meet each other for the very first time. Now, this particular part of the story is extremely important in that DC initiates a paradigm shift for Superman's character. What I mean here is that where Doomsday punches Clark to virtually no effect, the battle takes place in a neighborhood amidst several onlookers. Where the punch doesn't really do any damage, Doomsday kicks Superman, sending him flying through the house and out the back door, and into a tree. While Booster steps in and does what he can to stop Doomsday, he's ultimately unsuccessful, and that he's subdued with almost no effort and left nearly unconscious. Furthermore, with the various occupants of the house caught in the battle, Doomsday turns his sights to ice, breaking her ribs in the process, with the intention of killing the woman and her child. However, with Superman stepping back into the fight and telling the woman to leave with her child and older son as well as the remainder of the Justice League regrouping, the entire battle turns into a kind of last man at the Alamo situation, with the League combining their powers together in an effort to defeat Doomsday before his rampage can extend any further. What's also interesting here is that where the origin of Doomsday came after this story, we can combine the two elements together in establishing that where he can adapt to whatever killed him, he's also capable of adapting to whoever he's fighting at the time. The evidence for this comes when the combined forces of Bloodwind, Guy Gardner, Booster Gold, and Maxima prove to not be enough in that Doomsday is capable of withstanding all of their attacks. In addition to this, because he can resist their power, everyone in the League minus Superman literally drain every ounce of energy they have until they can't give anymore and end up having to drop out of the fight. Now the purpose of this is again to weed out the League and essentially empty the field of everyone who could do battle against Doomsday except for Superman. However, something I also want to do here is have a quick discussion on Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, and Hal Jordan. With a story like this which involves Superman and the Justice League fighting against Doomsday, we would normally expect and eventually see the rest of DC's core lineup make some kind of an appearance. But because DC was looking to create a situation where this question wouldn't be asked by fans who were following the complete continuity at the time, a series of stories were produced which answered this question. For Batman, his character was dealing with the prelude to the Nightfall story arc involving the return of Black Mask, Metalhead, and a host of other villains, all of whom had launched an attack against the Bat family and Commissioner Gordon at the orders of Bane. Under writer George Perez, Wonder Woman had been trapped in deep space by way of the actions of a villain named Thomas Asquith Rudolph, where she was eventually taken prisoner on a war planet. Under the writing of Dick Giordano, Hal Jordan was in space alongside the rest of the Green Lantern Corps dealing with the return of Krona during the 3-part series The Third Law, and I have no idea where the Flash was. But regardless, the result was that among the core members of DC's lineup, Superman was effectively the last man standing as the only individual capable of dealing with the threat that Doomsday represented. Now, one of the most important things to come out of this portion of the story is the fact that Superman actually gambles the lives of innocent civilians, potentially leaving them to die. The reason why this matters is that where his Golden Age counterpart routinely killed people, once Superman had become a larger-than-life character in DC Comics during the Silver Age, there was a strict no-killing policy, meaning that while the Man of Steel would pummel villains to the point of near death, he would never actually kill them. More so than that, in virtually all instances, Superman would actually abandon his attempts to fight a villain in order to ensure innocent lives were spared during a battle. Now, to focus a little more on this, the no-kill rule of Superman's history wasn't necessarily a rule laid down by editors so much as it was a rule that evolved on its own. What I mean here is that during the 1950s when Superman was increasing in popularity under Mort Weisinger, because the need was there for villains who could consistently return rather than forcing writers to create new villains all the time, it made no sense to have the Man of Steel engage in a fight with the antagonist and then kill him due to the fact that it would eliminate the opportunity for the villain to return. Instead, the tradition was born allowing for morality tales where criminals could learn from their actions, finding redemption in the process, while simultaneously allowing for the most hardened villains to continue coming back, challenging Superman in various fights. Now, having said that, in this conflict, when one of the houses is set ablaze allowing Doomsday the opportunity to get away, Superman seems to cast aside the idea of saving the innocent civilians in favor of ensuring that Doomsday does not escape. Now, for those of you looking to the idea of Superman letting these people die, this is actually not the case, and instead, Superman focuses on dealing with Doomsday as fast as possible with the intention of returning and helping the innocent people. Now, something that I thought was really cool about this was that it's actually a classic example of game theory. To sidetrack here, game theory is the idea of using mathematical probabilities to determine the most likely course of action someone will take when the success of their choices depends on the choices of others. In this instance, with Superman dealing with Doomsday, the success of his ability to incapacitate his foe depends on the success of the Justice League to muster the little energy they have left, rescue the innocents, and escape the building before anyone dies. However, because Doomsday had released such a brutal assault on the League itself, putting Blue Beetle in a coma in the process, the issue Superman faces is that he may end up having to fight a battle on two fronts, and then not only will he have to find a way to subdue Doomsday and save the residents, but if the fight extends to a populated area, Superman will also have to focus on the occupants within the city, keep them safe, while battling Doomsday at the same time. Realizing that Doomsday possesses the ability to leap rather than fly, the idea comes to Superman to bury Doomsday within the Earth itself, deep enough that even if it can't hold him forever, the weight of the soil should be heavy enough that it can temporarily trap Doomsday, allowing Clark to tend to the innocents, rescue them, and turn his attention back to the fight. In addition to this, once he arrives, we find that Bloodwind had successfully managed to free the mother and the youngest child, while the eldest son had gone to the paramedics for aid regarding his own injuries. Taking the mother and her child out of the flames and bringing them to the ambulance for analysis of their injuries, DC began the process of dropping hints regarding Martian Manhunter impersonating Bloodwind, and that rather than sticking around, he simply teleports away. From here, we move away from the conflict between Superman and Doomsday and travel to Metropolis to pick up with Lois Lane, Supergirl, and Lex Luthor. Now, something I want to point out here is that this version of Lex that we see in the story is both the real Lex and a clone at the same time. In an ongoing story arc spanning several Superman titles including Action Comics, Superman, and Man of Steel, Lex Luthor had acquired a piece of kryptonite and wore it constantly due to its ability to keep Superman away. However, the result was that Lex had developed cancer, leading to him faking his death and planting his consciousness in the mind of a younger clone. This version of Lex, as we see him here with red hair and a beard, is that very clone, functioning as a 21-year-old version of Lex, with the real Lex Luthor's mind operating inside. Something to also note is that if you recall my video on Supergirl, we had talked about how the original Kara Zor-El had died fighting in Crisis on Infinite Earths, with the post-crisis version being a synthetic organism from another reality. This version of Supergirl was known as Matrix, but had not yet absorbed Linda Danvers, meaning that for all intents and purposes, with the exception of a few extra abilities, in the eyes of the world, this is the one true Supergirl. Now, on its face, where the intention of Supergirl is to step in and help Superman overcome Doomsday, the idea of Lex is that she needs to stay behind in order to ensure a contingency plan, allowing for someone to battle Doomsday if Superman dies. I would argue, however, that the position of Lex is that because of his hatred for Superman, rather than allowing Supergirl to join in the fray leading to the likely defeat of Doomsday, because she's made to stay behind, Superman will likely die, which would see Lex's goals come to fruition. And so transitioning back to the conflict, with Maxima arriving and appearing to be the last member of the League left capable of fighting, when she throws Doomsday into a building, the initial response of Superman is that there could have been innocent people inside. Now, this isn't really meant to be a major part of the story and is actually only really designed to continue the idea that despite everything that's happening, Clark is maintaining his role as attempting to preserve the lives of innocent people. But in the momentary distraction, Superman seizes Doomsday from behind, attempting to allow Maxima the opportunity to use her vast strength to pummel Doomsday. But because the strength and speed of Doomsday is increasing as he fights, he proves to be too fast for either Superman or Maxima, breaking himself free in the process and continuing his rampage. However, because Maxima is less restrained than Superman and fights more with her emotions than with a clear mind, rather than coming at Doomsday reasonably, she instead rips a light pole out of the ground with the intention of using it to impale Doomsday, hoping to kill him in the process. And so despite the warning of Superman, the electric charge from the light pole arcs and in doing so, causes a massive explosion which knocks out Superman and Maxima, allowing Doomsday to move towards his final destination of Metropolis. And so following this, and as we bring this video to a close, the scene is met with the arrival of Guardian. Now, to be honest, my history on his character is a little fuzzy and the only information I found on him came from the DC Wiki, but because user-editable sources like Wikipedia's are unreliable, I don't rely on them and I won't do so here either. Instead, the only information I recall from the comics with Guardian is that at one point, he was a person named Jim Harper who was introduced in 1942 as DC's counterpart to Marvel's Captain America and that at some point a series of clones were made due to Harper having died. But regardless, the arrival of Guardian allows for a conversation with Superman where he reveals that because Maximo's actions in fighting recklessly and without thought to the consequences save for the goal of killing Doomsday, the only person Superman can rely on to bring this rampage to an end is himself. So in the last video, we had talked about how Doomsday's rampage stretched across a large majority of Ohio and the outlying territories, which saw the defeat of the Justice League with Superman as the last man standing. In addition to this, because Doomsday was capable of such tremendous jumps due to his physical power, his attack had been steadily streaming across the United States towards Metropolis, although we didn't really know why. Having said that, as we pick up with Action Comics issue 684, we join Superman as he searches out Doomsday following his departure after leaving Superman for dead. Now during this time, Clark actually gives us some extremely valuable information regarding how he views Doomsday. What he tells us is that while he doesn't have any information on where Doomsday came from, Clark's mind can't help but wonder regarding the possibilities, but also the kind of irrationality that Doomsday has displayed so far. What I mean here is that when the writers came up with this character, the intention was to present a villain seemingly devoid of higher level intellect, operating on primal instinct and without mercy. In essence, Doomsday was designed to be the perfect killing machine. However, within the comics, Superman had never seen or faced a foe on this level before. While it doesn't mean that he hasn't fought villains who were either mindless or primal, it does mean he had never fought both. Now this is particularly important and goes towards the very heart of what Doomsday is, and that because he can't be rationalized with but possesses the strength and speed of Superman, Clark is simply stuck in a situation where the best he can do at the moment is hold Doomsday off until he can formulate a plan of action. As a result, rather than being on the offensive like most of his battles, Clark is on the defensive, doing what he can to stave off Doomsday's advance. Now where Doomsday's path towards Metropolis was previously on the order of following the incredibly populated areas with no realization of where he was going, during his rampage, he stumbles across a Lexmart on the outskirts of Metropolis, which functions as an in-universe equivalent of Walmart. Where the store employees and customers flee due to Doomsday's actions being broadcast on TV, while he's in the store, he comes across a commercial advertising a wrestling match. Now I wouldn't go as far as to say that this was the writers poking fun at wrestling so much as it was using it as a means to illustrate why Doomsday shifts his focus to Metropolis. What I mean here is that because Doomsday relies on primal instincts rather than high-level thinking, the nature of this advertisement illustrates that the only thing Doomsday truly understands is violence and carnage. This is compounded on by the fact that at the conclusion of the advertisement, the commercial reiterates the location of Metropolis Arena, solidifying where Doomsday wants to go. In addition to this, the fact that Doomsday revels in carnage does not go unnoticed by Superman, and that when he follows Doomsday's path of destruction to the Lexmart store, during their fight, Clark takes notice of the fact that the more he and Doomsday fight, the better Doomsday becomes at fighting due to his love for it. Something to also note here is that the conflict is being covered by the combined efforts of Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, who are both attempting to stay out of harm's way despite everything going on. Now the reason why I say this is important is that when the story transitions to Lex Luthor and Supergirl, despite being from an alternate reality and not truly a native of Krypton, Supergirl also realizes that the situation is dire due to how much Superman is struggling against Doomsday. However, from the perspective of Lex, the conflict doesn't seem to be that extreme, and that he's seen Superman face off against beings like Darkseid and Lobo, both of whom are vastly strong and capable of higher level thought. In addition to this, where the battle between the two makes it into Metropolis proper, as the news cameras watch on and the world becoming aware of what's happening, Jonathan and Martha Kent point out the flaw in the mindset of Lex Luthor, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and the rest of almost all humanity. The flaw that I'm speaking of is that Superman is guaranteed to win the fight. Now this isn't necessarily a mindset held by various individuals due to arrogance regarding the belief that Superman is superior, and instead, they hold this belief because it's what they've come to expect. The reason why is that where the publications of Superman always saw him winning for the sake of allowing DC to continue creating stories, within the DC universe itself, the fact that Superman always won left no reasons for the citizens or even us as readers to expect otherwise. Where the Crisis on Infinite Earths event of 1985 effectively reset the continuity of his character, during the stories that appeared between 1985 and 1992 during this story, Superman had fought everything ranging from gods like Darkseid to monsters like Lex Luthor, and always proved himself to be capable of winning while continuing to take the higher road. As a result, both the citizens of the DC world as well as us as readers were unable to conceive of an instance when a battle between Superman and another foe would amount to an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. To this end, where the battle between the two raged throughout Metropolis, Superman's efforts were aided by the US military, as well as varying citizens taking up arms against Doomsday once the gravity of the situation came into full view. However, despite their actions, with the exception of Superman, there was no one on the planet capable of handling Doomsday or bringing an end to his rampage, and these various efforts actually did nothing but incite further irritation in that Doomsday considered them a nuisance, and Superman saw them as getting in the way. From here, the story begins its kind of crescendo towards Superman's inevitable death, and what I consider to be the best part of the story. With his life quite literally hanging on the line, one of the greatest elements of Superman is maintained regarding his concern for the lives of others. On its face, his fight with Doomsday may seem as though Clark has no concern for the goings-on of Metropolis' citizenry, and that the two are engaged in a battle that's literally seeing the collapse of buildings and partial destruction of skyscrapers. But despite this fact, Superman moves the helicopter of Jimmy and Lois Lane out of harm's way in order to keep them and the pilot from being killed by any number of factors, including the sheer force of his impacts with Doomsday, flying debris, or whatever else happens to come at them. Furthermore, where Superman speaks with Lois in saying that he is the last line of defense between the destruction of Metropolis as a whole and its salvation, because of this, he cannot stand down. And so taking her in his arms for the final time, Superman reminds Lois that no matter what happens, he will always love her. Now the importance of this cannot be overstated, and that what it means is that us as the reader and Superman are finally on the same page, and that Clark has come to grips with the fact that defeating Doomsday will most likely mean the end of his life. Now the reason why I enjoy this part of the story so much is that in truth, it highlights and goes to the very heart of everything that Superman stands for. What I mean here is that if we cast aside his role as the first superhero, the iconic uniform, the cape, and all the unnecessary fluff and look at him for what he represents, Superman is symbolic in terms of the greatness of what humanity can become, but also reflects the flaws in humanity as they are. Where I have my own thoughts on this, which I'll get to here in a second, I think that the essence of what makes Superman such an iconic hero was summed up in an article written by USA Today in 2013, prior to the release of The Man of Steel. As it states, searching for identity is a very human concept, but what makes Superman and his alter ego Clark Kent the ultimate superhero icon is that he has reflected our culture and society ever since his first appearance in Action Comics #1, and his crash landing in a cornfield as a baby and being raised by two Kansas farmers is, in a way, the story of the American immigrant. Since Siegel and Shuster created The Man of Steel in the 1930s, the core narrative of Superman has been and continues to be the values and belief about the US experience being strong enough and good enough to address the troubles facing the generation engaged with the character. During the Great Depression, Tarzan and Flash Gordon were popular in comics because they transported Americans elsewhere. However, when World War II encroached on our shores, America started getting scared, after which a giant, almost straight from the flag character arrived who had come to save us. Superman marched with the troops and fought Nazis in the late 1930s and into the 1940s, but he was also a reaction to industrialization, to the power of big business, and was created as a social agitator, a character who fought for the oppressed and the weak. In the 1950s, Superman went from anti-authority to a sort of uber cop, since the post-war era is where we saw ourselves as the world's peacekeepers, and then the Man of Steel of the 1960s and 70s had stories that touched on the counterculture and young people not really having a good sense of who they were, or where they came from, or where they were going. Having said that, in my mind, Superman's willingness to sacrifice his life remains one of the utmost important parts of his character, and in my opinion, is where he really stands out. What I mean here is that when Superman moves from the mindset of stopping Doomsday to killing him, his character as a whole experiences a paradigm shift, and that because he's never killed following the reboot of Crisis on Infinite Earths, this is designed to tell us that the death of Superman is effectively locked in. Furthermore, in a kind of bittersweet irony, during the battle, Superman comes to the realization that Doomsday's weakness are the varying bone protrusions from his body. The reason why this is so bittersweet is that it's tantamount to winning the lottery on your deathbed. This bit of knowledge was only gained by Superman towards the final fight between himself and Doomsday, but at this point in the battle, Clark was simply too weak to capitalize on this bit of information. And so as the story begins to wind down with both Clark and Doomsday putting their all into the final attack, the death of both beings comes in somewhat of a murky way. What I mean here is that DC doesn't actually give us a clear explanation of how both Superman and Doomsday died. DC simply tells us that at the end of the story, they're both just dead. However, digging a little deeper into the history, the only conclusion I can come to is that within this story as it was originally written, Doomsday and Superman had simply just beat each other to death with their attacks. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and let me know how you guys feel about the death of Superman. Do you think it was a good story? Do you feel it was kind of like, meh, it's whatever? And I will catch you guys later. Peace.